Welcome back to Colorful Clipboard. And Carrie and I are so glad that
you got to start it again.
I am nowhere. Okay, it's all Gary's fault. Marie, delete that.
Or you could put it as an outro at the end.
You could make it might be more fun. You know, we never always probably need a blooper. Okay, let's try this again. 1. Welcome back to Colorful Clipboard. Carrie and I are so glad that you are joining us today. Today, we are going to talk about, whoops. So basically, we are going to introduce a 3-week series of what to do when somebody falls, when you have that child, staff, or even yourself who perhaps maybe has
more than a cut, a significant injury.
More than a Band-Aid. And so, Carrie, why don't you share with us a scenario related to a kid? I've got a couple in my back pocket, unfortunately, but let's go ahead and start with a scenario that you've worked with that perhaps maybe your staff, let's start with a great one. Let's start with one that your staff handled exactly the way they were supposed to.
Well, I've been remarkably lucky considering how many years I've been in the industry. So the 2 that popped into my head both have to do with infants. And so the one I want to talk about is a child brought back from the playground a leaf, which they failed to disclose to the teachers. And so the kid had, I don't know, stuck it in their overalls or something like that. And so they washed their hands and then put them immediately in the high chair for snack or lunch. And the child sitting there while the teacher's back is turned getting food together, the child takes the leaf out and puts it in their mouth. And again, the teacher didn't, I mean, we're presuming that's what happened because nobody was watching, right? And the child didn't have the leaf in their mouth when they came inside. And so they're feeding this child spoon food, mushed up bananas, mushed up peas, and the child starts to not be able to swallow, and ended up the leaf was blocking their airway. And so when the teacher saw that the child wasn't swallowing, and then the child then was like, wait, this child's not breathing. And then they took the child out of the high chair, flipped him upside down, did a nice little thump on the back. Leaf comes out. That's how we know that that's what the problem was. And the child starts screaming. And then the child immediately wants to eat because they're hungry and they're mad. And the teacher's like, I'm not giving this child food right now. They need to be checked out by a doctor. So they went and gave the child a bottle, figuring milk would be okay, to help the child calm down and get something in their tummy while they waited for the squad to come.
Great. So I love that example, and I love how you shared what the teacher did. So what are the other bits and pieces that were left after that? So we got the squad came. What else kind of happened at the same time?
So the teacher went with the baby in the squad because that's what you do. And this was way back in the dark ages when everybody didn't have a cell phone. So when they got to the hospital, the teacher called the school to say, we've arrived. This is the hospital we are at, and we're good. This is the update. And then parents were called, said, this is where the child is. Child was back at the center the next day.
All right. And so are there stipulations to letting regulatory agencies know? How does that work?
Well, here in Texas, licensing would have to be notified within 48 hours of that happening.
Okay. All right.
Well, I think it's 2 business days, but I just put it in everybody's head as 48 hours because I've known centers to get cited because they're closed for, Memorial Day or whatever, and something happened on a Friday and they didn't notify within 2 days. Well, it's 2 business days, but some licensing reps get a little wound up. So I just tell everybody 48 hours.
I think that's a great safety caution. So
I mean,
I've got 2 that I'm going to give.
okay, but I was going to say one of the things that I know there's probably, a couple of people listening to this going, wait, why were the parents not called until the kid got to the emergency room? One, this was back in the days when not everybody had a cell phone, so you couldn't text. But I definitely wouldn't text your child's in an ambulance either. And, I live in a metro area where there are multiple hospitals. And until you know which hospital that ambulance is going to land at, I don't think you should call. If you know that the child is going to go in an ambulance, don't call the parents until you know where the ambulance landed.
Well, and also because of the metro that you're in, make sure that, well, obviously you're taking the health form and the health release form.
Yep.
From the child's folder, which might actually have a hospital request, since we do actually now have children's hospitals in our metro. When we did not necessarily have specified children's hospitals, that may not have necessarily been an issue. And depending on when you're listening to this broadcast, at some point in time in the Austin metro, we will actually have 2 Dell Children's Hospitals. Just we will have a north and a central. So we will need to make sure that people continue to really be communicative and include addresses or details, because even telling that you're with Dell, especially right now, I automatically assume that's the children's hospital, but there is a Dell Seton campus downtown, or not downtown, but north of downtown by the university, that is a teaching hospital. And it still goes by Dell. So Dell is no longer just the children's hospital.
Well, but also the thing that I think a lot of parents, directors, human beings don't know is that you can have a request, but that doesn't mean that that's where the ambulance is going to drive. Mm-hmm. Because if the EMTs, paramedics, whatever, think that this child is in acute distress, they're probably going to take them to the closest hospital, mm-hmm. not necessarily the children's hospital. Or if they think it's a child specific thing and they need to have a pediatric radiologist or whatever, then they're going to take them to the hospital that has more expertise with that, even if that's not the one the parents put on the form.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
And
you don't necessarily get to decide where the squad's going, because it also may be the medical director who's over that agency, may also, and it may be also crowd situation. So again, if you're talking about a holiday weekend, that perhaps is the problem, if everybody and their brother is also doing things that Friday or that Monday, there's a good chance that those emergency rooms might be a little busy.
Yep. So I know that there have been things that happened to your physical, your personal children at childcare centers. So why don't we do let's kind of escalate. So we have somebody who choked. Now let's go to your second to youngest child.
So Carrie just shared with us a story of an infant or young Todd, but since they were eating off of a spoon and somebody was feeding them, we're going to go with an infant.
Yes, definitely an infant.
And so the one I'm going to share next is actually a toddler scenario. And so we all have that toddler who, just because they can walk or as they learn to walk, they go where they want to go. And may not necessarily go where, as a teacher, you're wanting them to go. And so the program that my third child went to, they were about 2.5, and it was a program with lots of doors, and lots of doors that would kind of, open and close. not necessarily automatically, but there was a delay. So it kind of pneumatics, is that how you describe those? So they'd kind of close slowly, but then suddenly. And so in this situation, we did not handle pickup that day at school. It was actually done by their mom. And so the mom picked them up from school, took them home. And so as far as mom or dad knew, it was mom to begin with. Nobody called during the school day. When mom picked up that child from school, it was, oh, they got their finger smushed in a door. Now, currently, we would expect some communication because everybody and their brother has a cell phone. So there would be an expectation that somebody might have called because.
Well, there should have been a call anyway. I don't care what decade it is.
Well, especially because, again, after 22 years, that child actually still very much remembers the situation and is very clear that it was on the way to recess before lunch. So it was early in the day. Now, at the time, we were told it happened right before the end of the day, which is why they didn't call mom, because mom was already on her way. Again, it's hard to say now. It's been a little bit. So she got her fingers, they got their fingers caught in the door. And when they came home, it had a simple Band-Aid. So this doesn't really sound like something that should have been anything more than that until mom went to go take off the Band-Aid. And not only did the child scream, just an awful scream, there was a big gush of blood, and it was obvious that the finger was not necessarily intact. So those of you who are listening are probably going, ew. So maybe we should put a caveat on the beginning of this episode that says, don't listen to if you're eating. At this point in time, my husband was a military medic, and so very familiar with emergency procedures. Met mom and child at the emergency room. There was x-rays done and 11 stitches. So obviously this was an injury that was above and beyond a Band-Aid, regardless of what the program tried to do. So here's a situation where the program tried to make it a Band-Aid. We do know that program got cited. That program did not do the reporting within 48 hours. And let's just say that program really didn't last much longer. And it wasn't necessarily because of me or because of this scenario alone. But it is something that should have been a red flag to everybody involved because you had teachers who weren't. And
that center lost the enrollment of 2 children the next day.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't go back. And I handled some details that were probably not necessarily mine to handle, but I did. So so that was a situation where the child supervision wasn't on point. The teacher was at the front of the line. I had a kid who had their own idea of where they wanted to go. And so they were on their own way. And so they weren't being supervised and nobody really knew where they were. And then depending on which storyline you listen to, then there's concerns of, and just so if anybody knows, the fingertip is fine. That child has full sensation over that fingertip. But it was a very stressful next few days for the parents and the child, just because of infection, and we weren't really sure how long it had not been properly taken care of. So I don't know, do we want to talk about, okay, so this is one of those, we know that first aid and CPR is not mandatory for every teacher in the building. However, I disagree on a personal level. I understand why perhaps not everybody does have it. But I think it's easier because then you always know you've got somebody who's on staff.
It makes it, so much easier from a staff perspective, because then you can have anybody in the classroom by themselves when the numbers go down, as opposed to, I'm sorry, you can't go home early today because you're the first aider for this classroom.
Exactly.
So yeah, again, I would say best practices is everyone on staff. I don't care if they're your cook, they're your bus driver, maybe not your janitorial staff if you have janitorial staff,
Oh,
but
if the janitorial staff ever have come in contact with kids,
I mean,
yes.
I would rather just have everybody get the training, because you never know when they're going to be the closest person to the person who's injured. I'm going to just do a complete one, not 180, I don't know, 87-degree turn. I don't know. um, and talk about a place where my daughter worked, and there was a lot of child supervision, and the only people who had first aid and CPR were the managers. And because that's all that was legally required.
Are you talking about the place that Marie also worked?
Yes.
Okay, so it was after Marie left, because when
Yep.
Marie was there, she was actually the highest trained staff person at 14.
Yep. And so my daughter was the office manager, and she was a Girl Scout all the way through, and so did all the different levels of first aid except for the last one, because we couldn't find anybody who met our council's criteria the year that she wanted to do it. And so she was very comfortable with first aid. She also is a somewhat klutzy person and has had multiple concussions, so she has that knowledge also. And there was a kid who was playing, so it's an indoor gym kind of a place, and there was a kid playing, and they got a headlock. What is that in real people words? What's a headlock?
Laceration.
Laceration, cut, scrape. Yeah, they were bleeding a lot from their forehead, and the two staff members who were supervising literally froze. There's three things that happen when you're in a dangerous situation. You flee, fight, or freeze, and they both froze. My daughter's in the other room, sees this, and is like, and goes in and is like, okay, where are the gloves? Somebody get me some gauze. She's just like right on it, and doesn't understand why the parents of the child aren't doing anything, and neither are the supervisors of that group of children. And be aware that if you only have one staff person for that group of children who has the first aid and CPR training, they might be a freeze person. They freeze in a crisis. And then the other person in that group maybe doesn't have the training. So while they might be, an action taker in a crisis, they don't know what to do.
Yeah. But what the other part of that's always good is that the more times your staff are exposed to that training, the more comfortable they're going to be, even if they never actually have to do anything. So even if all they actually have to do is call 911, sitting through that training multiple times gives them the confidence that they know exactly what to say and do when they call 911. So
another question is, could we do a workshop if you've got somebody on staff who has a theater background and has access to theater blood? Could we do a workshop where, you have crisis actors come in, people who are pretending to be wounded? I'm sure you could find some 7 and 8-year-olds who would be perfectly happy to act like they've been wounded, for your staff to practice.
I'm pretty sure you could find some Girl Scouts who need to get a badge. I
think that's great. Yeah.
And if you're looking for fake blood, you don't even have to go that far. It's called Hershey syrup and red food coloring. So
okay, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's called budget triage, because you can find high-end triage for people who generally work in the mortician community. However, every wilderness first aid class and above does use simulations, and they do simulations with budget versions of trauma looking. So, broken bones are really chicken bones that are just on your skin with mortician's wax. And all right, so before I keep going into that,
but I'm just trying to give the people another way for their staff to maybe get past the freeze.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what will cause people to get past the freeze and what won't. What's their adrenaline flow? Is it somebody they know? Is it somebody they don't know? Is it their own child? I mean, everybody responds differently. I've never had a problem taking care of emergency first aid for my own kids or kids I know, but I also know that that's not the same for everybody. So our third and final, maybe not final, our third example that we're going to use is, again, it's another situation, and it was a fluke accident. So this is not something that was as a result of lack of supervision or sneaky behavior. This was absolutely after school kids doing what after school kids do, even young after schoolers. He was.
Yep. Keep going.
So I had to think how old he was. He was 8. So, and so he's just outside on the playground, right? He's just playing. And, they were pushing each other in one of the tire swings and pushing the tire swing around, where he fell and landed on his shoulder. And again, sometimes that doesn't sound like a horrible component, except it landed on the shoulder at just the right angle if it cracked the collarbone. So, although I wasn't there, I was also not a parent on any of the paperwork because he was visiting his dad. And so this is a situation where dad was called immediately. Dad knew exactly what hospital, but it happens to be a situation where another major metro, but they literally were 2 blocks from an emergency room of a hospital. That was where they were going to go. Like, it's like, we're not going to take you anywhere else. You're going over to Mount Carmel. So they went, he got his x-rays, he was in, he was out, he was back at camp, he was back at his program the following day, obviously doing some different activities. And they did do a write-up. The biggest problem was the write-up is that there was a lot of things that were just missing. So it wasn't that it was wrong. It just lacked a lot of information. So it was really hard for my husband's insurance, my first husband's insurance at the time, to pick up the expenses because there was a lot of information that was missing. So it was one of those situations where we ended up having to go back and forth with the program to get the complete documentation. And I really do think that the staff were early college. And I think they were just fearful for their job, and they weren't properly trained in how to document. They handled the situation correct as far as who to call, when to call, who to notify, all of that bits and pieces. Our biggest problem was truly the documentation of the scenario.
So, we've now given you 3 stories, we
probably have some more.
Oh yeah, we could come up with more. That's why I only came up with 1, because I knew we were going to do your 2. So, and in each of those, there's some parts that went wrong. So you, as a school leader, use these as examples of things to not copy. I don't know what all should have been maybe changed in the infant one, other than, have your infant staff look in babies' mouths before, when they come in from a playground, just in case they have stuck a leaf in there, because leaves are choking hazards. You won't choke to death. An adult wouldn't choke to death. An older kid wouldn't choke to death. But little babies and young toddlers don't have as much blood volume, so it's a problem. Anyway.
And it's funny because when you were telling that story, I kept waiting for you to tell me it was a poison ivy leaf. And that
it was an elm leaf. So this is back when they taught us to swipe, which no longer you're no longer supposed to swipe, but this was when you're supposed to swipe. And they couldn't get it because it's an elm leaf, and elm leaves are little. If it had been an oak leaf, this kid would have had a much less traumatic day. So, I mean, maybe don't plant elm trees around your infant playground. I don't know. because kids will find stuff to stick in their mouth. They could do the same thing with a piece of construction paper, right?
I'm thinking all those little rocks that kids stick in different places.
Well, that was another story I thought about. That was the other one that immediately popped in my head, was the kid who put a bean in the nose, and nobody knew that they'd put a bean in the nose until a little piece of green started showing at the nostril a couple days later. Because the bean was growing. That was fun. So that was another trip to a doctor's office. But in each of the situations, you've got different steps that needed to be followed. When a child is bleeding profusely, wrapping a really tight Band-Aid on it, and then not telling anyone that it happened because you're like, I messed up, I wasn't supervising, and I don't want to get in trouble. Well, that's obviously what that teacher did, right? They wrapped the Band-Aid up really tight so as to restrict blood flow, and then didn't tell anybody until the end of the day because they were afraid they were going to get in trouble. And then in addition to that, the staff being afraid for their job, which you had in both of your situations. And in addition to that, you had a director who, when notified that you guys took the child to seek medical care, didn't file the appropriate report with licensing.
Yeah.
And in the other situation, you had people who weren't trained in how to do the paperwork, and again, were afraid of losing their job. So we need to help our staff understand that a child getting hurt is not going to mean your job unless you lie about it. And if you lie about it, I'm firing you.
So I think one thing that's really great about all these scenarios that we can kind of use in kind of our wrap up is take these 3 scenarios to a staff meeting. We have a lot of directors who call us who are often stuck on what to do, or what kind of staff meeting or training should they be doing. And if you have not sat down with all of your staff to review how to document an injury, an illness, some sort of episode that's happened on a playground, this is a great time to use one of our examples. Even if you have examples at your program, I really discourage you from using your own program's examples, because you don't want somebody to feel like they've been called out. You don't want somebody to feel like they know who you're talking about, who maybe didn't do something right. Or make up your own scenarios. Just make sure they don't match ones that have ever happened at your program. And it's a great opportunity to walk through. I know that there are programs out there who their accident report forms are literally nothing but check marks and fill in the blanks and like no narrative. I don't know how that works from an insurance standpoint. That probably wouldn't have necessarily helped us any, but at least it takes the staff to fill in all the blanks. They know that they aren't putting any emotion into what happened, right? It's what time, and it's who, what, where, when, why, and how. It's what time, where, to whom, by whom, if there was another person involved. Just make sure that they actually really have a clue on what they're writing. If you need examples or ideas, reach out to us at Kate and Carrie at Texas, Kate or Carrie.
Yeah, those are 2 different emails.
Yeah, Kate at Texas Director or Carrie at Texas Director. We may have to make one that's Kate and Carrie at Texas Director, but we don't want to. We have enough email to check. So, but feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what it is that you need help with. We're happy to help you come up with some additional scenarios. And if you want some of those live 7-year-olds, or they might be 10 or 11 that can just play a 7-year-old on TV. Anyway, so let us know if there's anything we can do to help.
Have a great week, and we'll see you later. Okay, we're now going to do the intro. Marie, if you could put this intro at the beginning, we'd appreciate it. So welcome. No, we're going to do the welcome in a minute. So this week's episode that is coming up has some kind of graphic description of injuries. Don't listen to it while you're eating or if you have a woogie stomach. It's an important topic, but we wanted to let you know in case you're listening to this while having your morning breakfast tacos.
Okay, will you do me a favor right now while we're thinking about it? Send that email to Marie so that. Welcome back. We are so glad that you are joining us today. We are really excited for week 2, and we are continuing our experience and our exposure of Oops, Somebody Fell. And so today's Oops, Somebody Fell is not about kids. It is actually about a staff person. And we know that everybody looks at what do we do when that kid hurts themselves? And I have run into very few programs that talk about, think about, have included in their emergency action plan, what happens if it's a teacher. So examples of this could be, do you know the allergies of your staff? Do you know who's allergic to mustard? Who is allergic to strawberries? Who is allergic to bumblebees? Also, do you have current phone numbers and contact for whoever would be their significant other?
Or their emergency contact. It could be, their best friend. It could be, their mom.
Do you have the current phone number and contact information? Because a lot of times, especially if you've got staff in their 20s, that can change weekly. So always try to encourage that staff to keep perhaps a permanent resident or a permanent somebody, even if that person's not local, but somebody who might have numbers of local people.
Yeah.
So today, again, we've got some scenarios to share. They are very real scenarios. Carrie's got one. I've got one. We've probably got another one in there. We'll see if we can't dig up 3. If not, we can always make one up to get you thinking. And and we're going to talk about different components of what to do, what not to do, and again, who do you need to call? So, Carrie.
Okay, so in this scenario, well, we could play it 2 different ways, but the way it actually happened was the teacher was at their house, literally about to pick up their handbag and head out the door, stepped on something, slipped, and broke their arm. Well, their arm up by the shoulder, but they didn't have anybody. They can't drive. They have a broken arm. And called 2 relatives who lived within 5 minutes of them. And neither one of those people responded to the call in the way that you might hope that your family would respond to the call. And so this teacher was thinking, okay, I'm going to take the bus to the emergency room. Called another teacher and said, okay, I'm going to take the bus to the emergency room. And that person said, no, call Carrie. And we got her to the hospital, spent the entire day because they did an x-ray and they're like, no, there's nothing broken. And the answer was, look at the amount of pain this person is in. You need to do more examination. What else can you do for us? I know that there are breaks that don't show up in an x-ray. What else can you do? They ended up doing a CT scan. I don't know why cats need to be involved in this. But apparently the cats were able to find out that she had a break on the inside of her arm up by the shoulder. And, she's out of work for a week. Tried to come back to work the day after. Did not work out. That did not go over well. Pain got to a 7 from a 4 pretty quickly. Even though she wasn't lifting and carrying anything. It was just the act of moving. Like there's a lot of, I don't know if any of you've noticed this, but in education, there's a lot of moving that happens. And that's not great when you have to immobilize a joint. So in that situation, you know, it didn't happen at the school, but it absolutely affected the school. And, you know, because they did not have a support system that was acting the way you would want a support system to act, it also took me, you know, being there. So even if you've got staff who have family nearby, that doesn't mean that they're going to step up when your staff member needs a ride to the hospital. And, you know, we hire a lot of people who don't have a lot of, you know, I mean, we hire people in their 20s. A lot of times people turn 18 and they're like, yay, I'm free. I'm going to move to wherever because they're very excited about being a young adult. So you're probably going to have some staff who don't have family. They just have friends nearby. And if they, you know, are having a really bad cold or they've broken a bone and it's at the time everybody's going to work, who's going to be available to help them?
Great. So Carrie is going to give another one that's going to be more related to, and I'm going to give her a chance to talk about it. You know, we often have staff in childbearing years. So what happens if you have a staff person who has to be on bed rest or gives birth early, or any of those? So she'll do that here in a minute. In the meantime, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to respond to staff who say they don't feel well and where to go with that. So we all know that staff person who really can't afford to take a day off of work, right? They don't want to, they're not going to, so they've come into work, they don't feel good. You know, they're constantly having you come cover their room. They are in the bathroom for long periods of time. They come out of the bathroom holding their lower right quadrant, and they just don't feel good. Now,
Kate, what is the lower right quadrant for people who did not go to nursing school?
Okay, so in your abdominal area, think of it as 4 areas, right? So it's, you know, it is a Simon Says. So you've got the 4 big buttons, and right is to your right and left is to your left. And so the lower part is right here. There's not a whole lot in the lower left quadrant as far as important organs. There is an annoying organ, or not even really an organ. There's an annoying body part called the appendix that does exist in that part of the area. So one of the reasons that I bring this up is that somebody having an appendectomy or an appendix attack isn't going to manifest itself going, hi, hello, come take care of me. It's going to generally, even male or female, they're going to feel more sick. And if you have somebody who is not sneezing, they're not, you know, vomiting profusely, they don't have horrible diarrhea, they just don't feel good, chances are they're going to try to come into work. So somebody who is having an appendicitis, they can end up with not keeping fluids in or down, or they just may be tired and lethargic. Whatever the reason is, I don't care if you have a staff person with the flu, or it's an appendicitis attack, gallstone attack, gallbladder attack,
uterine.
Work really, really hard with your staff to make sure that they know that if they don't feel good, they need to go home. And Carrie used a number system with pain as far as maybe 1 to 10. Again, depends on the people, because, you know, I'm not sure, you know, in my life, I've probably only ever had a 10 once. And that was probably truly at delivery of my son. So, you know, the rest of it is, you know, what am I comparing it to? So
Yeah. So you have to ask them what they think a 1 is and what they think a 10 is. Because people definitely have different answers to that. A 5 is supposed to be a level where it impedes your ability to function.
yeah. And again, even though it may not impede their ability to function, because again, a lot of people with appendicitis, gallstone attacks, I mean, they'll still be up and running. They just don't feel right. Please, please, please. We talked in the last episode about how sometimes people get a little nervous about reporting things because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. Well, here's a similar situation. We have people who still come to work when they have a fever because no one's checking the staff if they've got a fever. The staff don't feel good. So unless, they can really come up with a reason why they have to stay home, they won't. But if you've got staff who all of a sudden pass out, something drastically changes in their personality, or they just become to the point where they cannot function, do not send them home. Call 911, have them go to the hospital. You don't want to be the reason why somebody has, an appendicitis attack that ruptures because they refused to go home, go to the hospital, and they felt like they needed their job. So,
and your liability insurance will pay for that ambulance trip. So don't let them go, no, don't call an ambulance. It costs too much money. Say, yes. And that's why we have insurance.
yeah, because what we don't want is we don't want them driving and getting into an accident. We don't want somebody else driving them and them not really going, talking that person out of taking them, or something happen and it causes a problem for the person who's driving. Because if somebody passes out on you and you're driving and they're laying on top of you, it makes it a little difficult to drive. Just saying.
Yeah.
So, all right. So there's the first two. We are in a field where we have a lot of people who are parents. And so, Carrie, how do we deal with, unexpected child birthing issues?
Okay, so we've got a couple of possibilities. The most common one is that somebody goes into labor before they're scheduled to. Many people are not Kate, and they actually, expect to be pregnant for 40 or 42 weeks. Kate has a 36-week gestational period. She's not actually a human. I don't know what animals have 36-week gestational periods, but whatever it is, that's what Kate is. But we think we're going to go 40 weeks. And so a lot of times our staff are like, okay, so I want to have like 2 weeks before I have the baby to get ready. Then I'll have the baby. Then I'll take a couple weeks, I'll take 6 weeks after. So it's, 8 weeks altogether. But not all babies agree that they're coming at 40 weeks. Some babies, one of my babies, decided that she was going to come at 24 weeks. She was like, okay, you've known I'm in here for a little while. I'm going to come out now. And I've had staff who also thought they were going to give birth on a certain day or, about a certain time. And 2 or 3 weeks before that, they go into labor. And so your substitute plan for who's going to cover a classroom when you've got a staff member having a baby needs to be flexible. You need to have a sub who could start earlier, or you need to have a contingency plan if they start earlier. Or if they go later, because some babies, I had another baby who was like 42 weeks sounds good to me. So some people work until their body says that they're not working anymore because they're making a baby. So again, have some flexibility with when that substitute is going to start substituting. It could be earlier, it could be later. The less common thing that happens is somebody is put on bed rest. If one of your staff members is put on bed rest and tells you, I can't not work for 4 months, like that's just not going to work for me. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to lose, I'm not going to be able to feed myself, blah, 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 which are absolutely valid concerns, because if they're on bed rest for 4 months and then they're recovering from birth and waiting for their child to have enough immune system to be able to go to childcare, you've got another 6 weeks after. So you're looking at almost half a year where that person can't work, if depending on what bed rest actually means. So the reason Kate's throwing me under the bus is that as a teacher, I got put on bed rest.
Well, so did I. I mean, that's part of the reason why Matthew was early. So, I mean, it was really just because I knew you had staff. Didn't you have some staff that have also
Yes.
had an early birthday and
yeah.
twin?
So early birthdays is, one thing, but if bed rest, if they're like, I can't not work for 4 months, then you need to talk to your doctor and find out exactly what they mean by bed rest. In my case, they said that I needed to be in a sitting or lying down position for all but 4 hours of a day.
Okay, so do you want to know what animals have a 36-week gestation?
Yes. What animal are you, Kate? You can't just sit there and laugh. It's dead air. We can't do that in a podcast.
I'm sorry. It was just really funny because I'm like, well, I want to know, what animal am I? Okay.
What are you?
Oh, hold on a minute. I was going to give you the math. Okay. So 36 times 7. So roughly 252 days.
Okay.
So that makes me roughly a deer or a bear.
You're a bear. You're not a deer. So Kate is now a bear.
Sorry, I just thought I'm like, well, I'm curious. What animal has that as a gestational period? All right.
So Kate's technically a bear. So in my case,
I'm really a mama bear. I love it.
Yep, you're a mama bear. So if I could spend 4 hours upright and I had to be sitting or lying down the rest of the day, the question was, what classroom could I be in and do that? And your answer may be different than mine. My answer was a toddler room, because I'm a really good toddler teacher, or at least I was. Who knows now? But I was a great toddler teacher in my 20s. And as long as somebody else would come in and do the playground time and diaper changes, I could run a toddler classroom from the floor. So that's what I did. So I think, we've got different things, and it's when your staff have medical issues, help them to ask the appropriate questions of their doctors. If they have something that happens while they're at the center, so if AD had broken her shoulder, I shouldn't have said her name. Oh, well, AD had broken her shoulder while at work, it would have been work's job to call an ambulance and get her to the hospital, because you would have had insurance to cover it, instead of having, friends and family drive the person to the hospital. I believe I have a, hard time spending $700 to drive somebody to the hospital for a broken arm, because very, very rarely does a broken arm end up in a dead person. But Kate has a different take on whether a person should drive their friends and family, or whether you should call an ambulance. So Kate, I'm queuing you up. Please step onto your soapbox and explain your very biased opinion.
I mean, I already did a little bit when I was talking about basically an internal or a soft organ kind of issue. So it wasn't a break, wasn't something you could definitely see with like a break or a laceration. But the one thing that you never ever know what's going to happen when somebody is in pain. And well, I mean, I'm going to toss this back to you a little bit, because we both are familiar with somebody in your family who sometimes pain can cause them to black out or pass out. And again,
yes,
if you're driving a friend and you know that the friend is in pain, and if the friend is in the passenger seat and passes out, You have no control necessarily of where they're going. They could end up over here. Okay. If something changes, if you have somebody who got stung by a bee, ate something, had a stomach pain, again, I love my parents dearly, but was not necessarily their smartest choice. One time when my mother drove my dad to the emergency room, because this is before he was at an age and point in time in his life where he would happily have a handicap tag. So he was not near the entrance to the emergency room when they got there. He was actually parked significantly out in the parking lot. So when he collapsed, guess what they had to do? They had to get a squad to come and get him in the parking lot. And so they were just fortunate enough, there happened to be a squad at the emergency room, empty and ready to go. So again, yes, I am very, very biased because you never know, things can change so drastically.
So why are you biased? What did you do competitively in high school?
So in high school, I actually competed against paramedics on medical scenarios, and I was an EMT in college and almost a nurse. And so I did spend an awful lot of time in my
younger years.
Oh, younger years. There we go. Especially when I start figuring out how long I actually spent. So I probably spent almost 15 years in the medical field actively, and that doesn't include the over 30 years I taught for American Red Cross, teaching the wilderness first aid and some of those kinds. So, being part of being first responders in wilderness scenarios where, you didn't really have an option, to being first responders in major metros, and having enough friends and family who've had situations where their situation did turn drastically and quickly. Even with, a medical professional as a spouse, I still probably would not have even taken the medical professional to the hospital by myself. And there has to be a really, really good reason, and I can't really come up with one on why I wouldn't have a squad come get them.
Yeah. And,
and money is not the reason.
Yeah. Because again, your insurance at your school that you are required to have will cover that ambulance trip for them. Okay. It won't necessarily cover the ER visit if it turns out to be, an appendicitis. But if they have an appendicitis, they needed to be in the ER anyway.
Because usually appendicitis turns into an appendectomy.
Yeah. So, they needed to get there anyway. So how they get there is going to be covered by your insurance. Once they get there, it had to happen anyway. And there are lots of people who don't like to go to an emergency room. And I understand that it's not a fun place to be, but I will tell you, you get seen by the medical professionals much faster when you come in an ambulance than when you drive up. When you drive up, they're going to presume that you have less of an issue. Mm-hmm. So you don't sit there for 4 hours if you arrive in an ambulance.
Yeah, and that, I'm going to take that back even to the Carrie's last scenario of childbirth. Again, we've got people come early, people come late, people will be put on bed rest, all these different scenarios. And then there's the people who literally water breaks and they're having a baby and they're at work. And it doesn't matter if it's the first baby or the fifth baby, you're always going to end up with that scenario of somebody who it doesn't take long.
Yep.
We've all heard the horror stories of the people where it took 24 plus hours to deliver a baby. But you also hear the people that, pretty much had one pain and pushed and they were there. So don't let somebody leave whose water broke going, oh, I'm going to drive myself. No.
What crazy people are driving themselves while in labor? It's been a long time, but I still am pretty sure I would. Not a good plan. Anyway.
And the reason I bring that up is because at work, your spouse is probably not with you. They don't have the go bag all packed. I can very much see teachers who are friends, bosses who are friends going, "Oh, I'll just take you to meet your husband." No, I don't care if somebody says, "Oh, I'm always a 24-hour person. This is my third kid." You know what? If it's your third kid, you're probably a 30-minute person. Your body's going, "We know how this works."
Yep. So basically, we're once again reminding you to make sure you have some standard operating procedures. I know this might sound like a broken record, but you need a standard operating procedure for how do you know who to contact if one of your staff members just passes out on a Tuesday? When do you call an ambulance? Who's going to ride with a staff person in an ambulance? And how are you going to do reasonable accommodations when they've got a broken arm, a broken leg, they're on bed rest, etc.? How are you going to figure out what is a reasonable accommodation? And maybe this is a moment to stop and think, should I have short-term disability available to my staff? Because a short-term disability policy would cover them when they're out for 4 weeks after an appendectomy, which is apparently how long you were supposed to be out, Kate. I just thought I would let you know.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
I'm aware. I'm just telling you that's apparently what you're supposed to do.
That's also supposed to be what you're supposed to do after having a C-section, and I went 3 days. So before I was driving a car. So this is definitely not one of those do what Kate does. It's do what Kate tells you to do. So
except for when it comes to squads, apparently.
Yes. So the only other thing left to make sure that you do remember is please, please, please make sure that you have your staff update their own medical histories and their own allergies, because it doesn't take much. Mustard, strawberries, things like that that are often show up in potluck kind of food, that people may or may not think about. And bumblebees, we had a director who came through our program who told us a story about a staff person who was, EpiPen allergic to a bumblebee. And this was before a lot of people were trained on how to use EpiPens. And so, and they only had one. They didn't keep one at their.
Well, yeah, because they're $300.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, that's a whole other conversation. But if you ever need an EpiPen, have somebody write a prescription for an epinephrine pen, because then they can give you the generic, which are like $5.
Yep. So, and the last thing we want to remind you, we talked about this earlier on the episode, but we want to again remind you, make sure your staff knows that their job is not in jeopardy if they go and have to be out for some period of time after getting an appendectomy or a hysterectomy or any other ectomies or broken bones, because you don't need people working through their newly broken bone at your center. It's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, no. So, but also there are going to be times, think about the age of your staff. And just since I had a procedure about a month ago and they said, oh, most people are back to work in like 3 days. And I was a good 3 weeks. And as you've already heard in stories, I am notorious for not taking as long as I should. And so I'm mentally thinking 3 days. I'm like, oh, that should be no problem. Yeah, 3 weeks in, and I'm like, seriously, people? And it wasn't a procedure. I didn't have a procedure that was traditionally done by people who are young. So it wasn't like I had one of those procedures that only 20-year-olds get.
It was not a belly button piercing, is what you're saying.
Not my tattoo.
Okay, guys. So we've talked about when kids break something or have some sort of medical emergency. Then today we talked about what happens when your staff has a medical emergency. Guess who we're talking about next week?
Okay, so I just want to end this on, we've decided that I am absolutely a mama bear, but I could be a gorilla and I could also be a California seal. Just thought I'd let y'all know.
See you next week.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Carrie and I are so glad that you are joining us today. We are going to talk about our third part of our series on Who Fell and Oops. And so today's Who Fell and Oops is all about you. So it is about directors. So if you are a director of an owner of a program, today we're going to talk about what happens when you're the one who is broken out, medical issues, any sort of Family Medical Leave Act, anything that just means that you're out, right? You're out, you're unavailable. Or it could be something maybe a little less. Maybe it just means that you're working from home and you're only available virtually. Whatever it might be, because if you are completely out of town, taking care of relatives out of town, or you hurt yourself on a trip and you're out of town, that is one very different scenario than you are available by phone to even still place, local orders at HEB and have them delivered or available for pickup. So kind of some different scenarios. And so today we're going to start with Carrie. Carrie has definitely, as a director, had her fair share of having babies, doing some oopses. I've had some oopses. We also know directors who've had other sort of interesting stories. We both have also had stories where had we been actively a director, it would have definitely forced us into changing how we did things. So we would have been forced to, in my case, I would have been forced to delegate. And so I would have been forced to make sure I had an assistant director, and I may or may not have been ready for that. I may not have already had that emergency action plan or standard operating procedure in place. But today we're going to talk about Carrie and babies.
Okay. So we talked about me and being pregnant in, I think it was the last episode. When I had my younger daughter, I was part of the day in a classroom and then director in the afternoon. And I had hired a substitute, trained them. I had where they were going to be once I came back from my 6 weeks of maternity leave, which I was very excited about because I hadn't had one the first pregnancy. I was very excited. And I went into labor and got a phone call from that person telling me that she had mono. I was not thrilled with this because I was actively in labor and I needed someone to cover my classroom. I could handle not having an on-site director for the day. I could not handle not having someone in the infant room for the morning. So I woke up my husband and said, we're going to have a baby today. And then I started calling people to try to find someone else to cover the infant room for me. And what it ended up being is my mother and my mother-in-law both covered the classroom, but I didn't have them on paperwork anywhere. They had their first aid and CPR because I was like, nobody's watching my kids who hasn't had first aid and CPR, but they weren't on paperwork. I hadn't done a criminal background check on them. So the day after I gave birth, I called licensing and I reported myself for having had caregivers in the facility who did not have background checks. And I said, but I am here today. And they were like, you're what? And I was like, yeah, yesterday I couldn't be here because I was giving birth, but I'm here in the infant room today. And so we're back in compliance. And my licensing rep said that they were not going to investigate. They did not feel like they needed to investigate that. So if you're going to have crises, it's a good idea to have mothers and mother-in-laws who have first aid and CPR training. But if so, also go ahead and get their criminal background check and put them on your substitute list. That is the only day either one of them ever worked at my center, but it would have been helpful for me to not have to call in on myself. And that was the day that I decided I needed to have a deeper substitute pool, because one person was not enough, because that one person could get mononucleosis while you're in labor.
So real quick, let's talk about that substitute pool. I know it's not really the goal of this call, but and I think most directors probably have a relationship with friends and family in a community. And even if these are people who don't have any interest in working in your center, but they love you and they would do just about anything for you, get them on that list, have them do that background check, because you just never know when you may have to get all the way through the bottom of the back, because it sounds like both of our spouses at the time have both worked in your center.
Yes.
Right. So I was like going, wait a minute. Both dads worked there at different times. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, my husband was on the list for a long time. He wasn't all the time, but there were definitely years when he was on the sub list. But again, that's a situation where I was starting out my center and I couldn't be a full-time director because we didn't have enough kids that I could get paid if I was just being a director, because it was early days. I had only, I think, 2 classrooms open at the time. And so that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So it wasn't the director part of my job, but it was, make sure you have a deep substitute list. But I also had told people that we were not accepting any new enrollments for 6 weeks. So anybody who toured the couple of months before, when I was just being, nice and round, I told people, you need to enroll now or you have to wait for 6 weeks. So I planned no new enrollments for 6 weeks because I was going to be on maternity leave. And I would have been reachable by phone. So any crisis that happened, I would have been reachable. I was still going to do the grocery shopping. But I was planning, it's not what happened, but I was planning on not being at the school during the day during the 6 weeks. Now, again, my kids are old. Now I would have been able to do all of the ordering and stuff like that online. And it can be delivered, and I would just have paid the extra $15 fee to have the HEB people bring it to my school instead of doing the drive up HEB order. I think that's a good use of money when the director is out sick, because you may not feel comfortable with putting someone else on your debit card or your credit card for placing those orders, or putting them on a checkbook. Again, we're old, we believe in checkbooks. So you might not want to have somebody else have that ability while you're gone, because you don't yet have the trust with sharing that. But spend the extra money when you're out with a broken something, or when you've given birth, to have it delivered to your school. I know it's more money. I don't care. You need to have policies in place. And, with the HEB order, you can have a credit card on file at HEB or at Costco or at Sam's that they automatically charge with that order. Yeah. So you don't have to give somebody your credit card information. It's on file in some cloud storage somewhere, and you can let your staff use that account and monitor it.
Yeah. So Carrie's talked briefly about, having kiddos while being the director, and that sometimes, again, having plans is always a great thing, but sometimes those plans don't go as planned. There have also been situations, when were you a director when you broke your elbow too?
Yeah, when I broke my radius. So, and the only reason that I found out that I broke it is that a little bit of a tendency towards workaholism, which I think is not uncommon in directors. We want to do everything for our staff. We want to do everything for our kids and our parents. So we work a lot of hours. And so I broke my arm in the morning, grabbing breakfast for my kids and myself. And then I went to work, put kids in their classrooms, etc. And I was in pain, and I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. And so I called my husband and I said, I'm just in pain and I'm having a hard time getting any work done. I think I'm just in the way here at work. I'm going to go ahead and go home and rest. And my husband's response was, "Excuse me, you're leaving work voluntarily?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Then you need to go to the doctor's office and get an x-ray." And I said, "I don't think I broke my arm. People say you hear a sound or you feel a thing when you break your arm. That didn't happen. There was no noise. I didn't feel a break. I moved my arm and I can't feel a stabbing pain. I didn't break my arm." And he's like, "You need to go get an x-ray." So I did, and he was right and I was wrong, and I will have to live with that shame for the rest of my life.
Directors have all kinds of stories. We have stories of things that we've done while we're at work, things that we've done that meant that we weren't going back to work on Monday. I've got two. One is, on a weekend when I was planting trees with my children, and I was absolutely doing something with a pair of pruning shears that I should not have been doing. And I ended up with a very nice gash on my arm. But because I was with a bunch of kids, I had to think very quickly about how I was going to respond. And so I did respond in a way and got to the emergency room that most of the kids really didn't have a true grasp of the level of the injury. However, it was such an injury that had I had to be in a classroom, I would not have been able to be into a classroom for at least 2 weeks. And so again, it wasn't unexpected. It was an accident. It was something I did not do at work. That if I was a classroom teacher director, like in other words, I had a shared position like Carrie did, I would not have been able to go back to work.
Or if you were in a position where you were just short staffed for that week because you had teachers who were out with the flu.
Right. Yeah. If I had to go into, let's put it this way, I could not have gone into a classroom. I guess I could have gone to work, but I couldn't have done a classroom. I might have been able to do the cook one-handed, would have made life a little dicey and interesting. And then another situation was, again, another one of those fluke accidents. I had a 3rd-degree sprain in both ankles at the same time.
Yeah, she's talented.
Yeah. Mentally figure that out. There's no walking on crutches. And my youngest was 18 months. So there was definitely not a lot of, still needed help around the house. So there wasn't like that was going to be really an option. It was a little farther along. Carrie and I do joke that we are old. So it was a little farther along that a lot of things were done. We could do a lot of email. We did have cell phones, but we didn't have nearly as many as we do now. And they were still pretty boring. Like, walkie-talkie was as fancy as we got. We had the Nextel phones. And so Carrie and I could walkie-talkie each other.
We loved those phones. They were great. They were great.
So it wasn't the summer that, there were definitely summers when I was the director that had that been an injury, that would not have been a good summer It would have been very stressful on everybody.
Yeah, when with my broken arm, I was unaware of how many things you need your left forearm for. Like I couldn't write on paper because I was so used to putting my left hand on the paper to keep it still when I wrote. So I couldn't sign checks. And again, I like checks. I'm a fan of checks. I still write checks. I'm aware I'm the only one. But I couldn't, like, I had a hard time opening doors because when you turn your right hand, your left hand actually turns a little bit in response. It's completely unconscious, had no idea you do it until you break your left radius, which is the turning bone. And your body's like, no, we're not opening doors anymore. So I started, going in through any door that had a lever instead of a doorknob. Which meant, there were some rooms where I was like walking down a hallway to get into the room as opposed to the way that was the most convenient, because that one had a lever and this one had a doorknob. And I mean, the typing one-handed is a nightmare, especially if you're somebody who's used to using your right hand primarily for the 10 key for the numbers. Because then I had to like figure out, okay, how do I get to an S? I was
down by the A.
Yeah, but I never look at it, so I didn't know where it was. So I had to it was very much, it was ridiculous. Everything took so much longer. And you're like, how is breaking your left arm making it so that your computer time is 3 times as long? Well, it's because nobody knows where an S is on the keyboard. I was unprepared for that. And I did have systems in place. I did have standard operating procedures, but it was for if I couldn't be at the school. I could be at the school. I was just ineffective. And so when and if that happens, give yourself some grace. Tell whoever you have to report to that it will take longer, and that if possible, you would like to do voice to text, or you would like to call them and leave them a voice memo or something like that, so that you're not doing what I had to do, which was hunt and peck like I was a second grader, in order to send a message to someone, in the software portal or whatever. If I was one of those directors now, so I know some directors who literally approve every message that goes out to the parents on their parent communication app, whether it's Hi Mama or whatever. And so they're going through and they're approving all of them. Can you imagine doing that with only one hand? That would be a point at which you go, you know what, this week, you guys say whatever you want to the parents. I don't care. And then the question becomes, okay, the things that you let go while you're dealing with an injury, how many of those things do you need to bring back when you come back from your case of COVID or your broken bones or your double sprained ankles? There are things that when that happens, you reconsider, do I need to do all those things? I'm not currently actively directing, and it was very helpful in July that I was not actively directing, because most of the month of July was washed out by my mother having COVID while we were in rural Wisconsin. We talked before about how I take a vacation every year the week of 4th of July. I did that, and my mom got COVID and she didn't test positive until everybody had left. So it was me and my mom in rural Wisconsin, and she was getting sicker and sicker. And, there was a whole bunch that went into all of that. And really, it was only 2 whole weeks that I was caring for her between when she was not yet in the hospital and when she was in the hospital. But then I needed like a week to recover from the emotional work of keeping my mother alive. and, all of the fear and anxiety of what would happen because she had paperwork she has not done. We should maybe do an episode about that. I know Evelyn talks about it a lot has talked about it a fair amount on her podcast. If you haven't ever listened to Evelyn Knight's podcast, we would recommend. But we should also maybe talk a little bit about what legal paperwork, if you're an owner, you need to have.
So as we wrap that up, I just want to make sure that you guys remember that when you start talking about standard operating procedures, emergency action plans, that needs to include you. A lot of times we've got those for our kids. We might have them for the teachers, but rarely do we have them for us. So if the last 2 years, unfortunately, has not taught you anything, it needs to be that you need to have an emergency action plan for yourself as a director or the owner, and that you are aware and that people on staff know how to get hold of your emergency paperwork. Where is your folder? Do you have a file with all the employees that have your allergies, your medical release, and all of that?
And who's going to be checking in to make sure you haven't passed out in your office? If you have a policy where anytime your door is closed, nobody even knocks, which I recommend, but you still need to have a policy, a secondary policy, that if nobody has seen you in 3 hours, somebody needs to knock on your door. Because there's nothing we do as directors that we're really going to be in our office for 3 hours, not wandering around checking on the center. Because you are in there and you're working and you're in the flow, and I get it, but then you'll be like, oh my God, I needed to check to see that, Matthias brought in his shot record. I didn't get it in my email. I got to go check Matthias's bag. So, we will be working, we'll be in the zone, but I've never known a director who stays in an office with the door closed for 3 hours. Something pops up in your head of something you need to go check on. So
absolutely. And I'm not saying that you have to be friendly with staff. You just need to decide for yourself if your stuff is going to be with every other employee and who is the number two.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that you have an assistant director, but there has to be somebody who knows that if you're out sick, if you fall and have a concussion, if you get stuck on another continent because you broke your leg while you were climbing the Eiffel Tower, whatever it might be, whatever horror story happens to you, or at least
you were going to Machu Picchu and you got elevation sickness.
Yeah. So, or you could do that in Colorado, but so whatever your issue might be, make sure that somebody on staff knows their number two, and talk to your staff as well as family members that are local to you about those bits and pieces, at least, of your business plan.
And when we say family, we don't just mean people that you married or are blood related to. A lot of us have our found family that counts as well. Yes. So have your support network, have a deep bench, pretend you're the NFL.
It doesn't have to be wide, it just has to be deep.
Yep.
So but they should be people that you trust. So yep. With that, we hope you guys have a wonderful week. If you need us, feel free to reach out to us at Carrie@texasdirector.org or myself, Kate@texasdirector.org, and have a wonderful week. Don't forget to share.
Bye.